As you continue to improve your game, you will have more tactical and positional ideas competing for your attention. How do you choose a move? Should you try to play a tactic, or do you need to improve your position first? Did your opponent's last move create a strong threat in the position, or should you ignore it and create an attack yourself? There are no easy answers to these questions, but the more you practice answering these questions, the better your move choices will be. Let's take a look at some positions and try to decide how to choose the best move. In this position, white has a serious advantage. White's pieces are far more active than black's, and notice that white has doubled rooks, putting pressure on f7. Black's king looks a lot weaker than white's king, and it looks like white has a crushing tactic. White plays rook takes f7 check, forcing king to h8. When you play a game of chess, it is important to think about what has changed in the position after every move. After calculating that white can win a knight by force, after king h8, white did not ask what's changed in the position after the last move, and quickly grabs black's knight with rook takes d7. By only focusing on what white could do and ignoring the opponent's ideas, what did white overlook? When black's king left the g-file, black's rook on g8 is now pointing at the g2 square, joining the queen hiding on a8. Black delivers checkmate with queen takes g2. Let's see what white should have done instead. After king h8, once white notices what has changed, what should white do? Should white immediately block the queen's threat with knight to f3? This move is good, but can you see a way for white to defend against checkmate and threaten to checkmate black? That's right, queen to h3. White protects g2 and also threatens checkmate on the next turn. By combining defense and attack, recognizing the opponent's ideas without giving up on your own ideas, white has a very strong attack against black's weakened king side and should go on to win this game with careful play. For example, if black plays knight to f8, protecting the h7 square from checkmate, one strong idea for white is to play rook e7, threatening to remove the guard with rook takes f8 on the next turn and deliver checkmate. Black's passive pieces, all on the back rank, are no match for white's active pieces working together. Most players prefer to attack and make threats rather than defend. When we are considering what move to make next, it's useful to ask, what move would my opponent play on the next move? White did not ask this question and only thought about white's possible moves and played queen to f3, attacking the rook on a8 and clearing the way for g4, trying to open up lines against black's king. It's tempting for black to decide where to move the unprotected rook on a8, but why does black need to react? Does black have a stronger threat? Do you notice all the weak dark squares around white's king? Black can play the powerful queen to c3, threatening checkmate, a much stronger threat than white capturing black's rook. Notice that there is no defense to queen b2 checkmate. How could white have avoided this unfortunate end? Let's take a look at the position again. If white would have asked what moves black could play on the next turn, white would soon realize that queen to c3 is a crushing threat. And since white does not have a stronger threat to make against black, white must prevent this threat. Can you see how white can defend the weak c3 square and attack black's powerful dark squared bishop? That's right, knight to e2. And after moving the bishop to safety with bishop to g7, now white can safely play queen to f3. And after rook to c8, threatening queen c2 checkmate, white should be okay after rook to d2. Sometimes you have to find patient, defensive moves before you can start building your position to attack. Let's take a look at one more position. Not all positions have simple attacking or defensive moves that you can find. In this endgame, the material is even, but the one weakness black has is doubled pawns on the c-file. Notice if white only thinks about attacking the weak pawn on c6 with knight to e5. White forces black to make a good move with c5. Black's main weakness in the position, the doubled pawns, will be fixed on the next turn with c takes d4, when black will have a very solid position. What should white do instead? As the c6 pawn is a weakness, this is a clear target to attack. White should first prevent black from removing that weakness. But how can white do this? By freezing the pawn on c6 with c5. Now that white has a concrete target to attack, c6, black is in trouble. After knight to d7, trying to prevent knight to e5, white can still attack c6 with knight to b4. And after knight to b8, white overwhelms black's defenses with knight e5. White will win the c6 pawn on the next turn and have good chances to win this endgame. Now that you've looked at ways to choose a move, it's time to prove that you can find the best moves. How often do you find yourself in the middle of a chess game, and when it's your turn to move, you have no idea what to play? It happens to all of us. When there isn't a clear tactic or obvious move to play, we need to find a plan. Sometimes plans can be complicated, long-term ideas, but more often they can be a simpler 2 to 3 move idea. In this position, with black to move, it isn't easy to find a move to play. Let's find a plan for black. Where do you notice the most tension in the position between the white and black pieces? Black has 2 pieces attacking the central pawn on d4, and white has 2 defenders. White's knight on f3 is an important piece. It protects the d4 pawn and also joins that pawn in putting pressure on the e5 square. Notice the knight on f3 isn't protected, and black's rook on f8 is x-raying the knight through the bishop on f6. Is there a discovered attack with the bishop? The bishop doesn't have a lot of moves available. There doesn't seem to be a good tactic. When you don't know what to do, one plan is to find your worst placed piece and try to improve it. One idea would be to play rook c8, moving the rook to a file that is not blocked by pawns, so it may open up soon. Notice the bishop on d7 is passive. It is guarding the weak e6 pawn, but other than that, it isn't very effective. Can you find a 2-move plan that improves the bishop and attacks the knight on f3? By asking that question, you may have found the strange-looking but powerful move, bishop e8. Black's plan is now clear. The bishop is going to move to h5 on the next move, improving one of black's less effective pieces and attacking one of white's most important pieces in the battle for the center, the knight on f3. After rook f to e1 and bishop h5, black attacks the knight, pinning it to the rook on d1. Black is now threatening to capture the knight and win the pawn on d4 by removing one of its key defenders. White responded to this threat by playing bishop e2, protecting the knight and clearing the d-file for white's queen and rook to help protect the d4 pawn. Now that the light-squared bishop has been improved, what should black do next? How can we continue with our plan to add more pressure to the d4 square? Can you improve a piece that isn't doing that much and add more pressure to the d4 target? If you felt the knight on e7 isn't very effective right now, great job. Black brings the knight into action and supports the plan to attack d4 with knight f5. Move by move, black is focused on improving pieces that weren't very effective and now has a comfortable position with all of the minor pieces working together to put pressure on the key d4 square. Black was able to convert this comfortable position into victory. Let's take a look at another example. In this position, both sides once again are fighting for control of the d4 square. White played the strange-looking move bishop d3, attacking black's bishop and also blocking the queen's protection of the d4 pawn. Before thinking about a plan, we have to check for tactics. Why can't black just win a pawn with knight takes d4? If we can't answer that question, we should accept our opponent's gift. Can you see white's trick? After knight takes d4, knight takes d4, queen takes d4. White has lured the queen to the d4 square, and now that it is unprotected, white wins the queen by using the discovered attack, bishop b5 check, checking black's king and revealing white's queen's attack on the black queen. Now that we understand that capturing the d4 pawn is a disaster for black, we need to come up with a plan. White's king is already committed to the king side, and black's king still has a choice. One plan is to play safely and capture white's bishop, and then castle kingside. This would be a solid choice, but can we find a more active plan? All of black's minor pieces are developed, and black has developed the queen to an active square on d6. Can you think of a more aggressive way to bring black's king to safety and plan to attack white's kingside? That's right, black can castle queenside. Now that black has castled queenside, knight takes d4 is a threat because white's bishop can no longer check the black king. Did black's decision to castle queenside create a clear plan? When you castle on opposite sides of the board, both sides should try to attack as forcefully as possible against the enemy king. Notice black allows white to trade bishops and double black's pawns on the f-file because black welcomes another pawn into the attack to help open up lines against white's king. After knight e2, protecting the d4 pawn, how can black begin to set up threats against white's kingside and start an attack? If you found g5, great job. The h3 pawn is a hook in white's position that black will try to rip open to start an attack. White's pieces are not as actively developed and are not yet prepared to attack on the queen side. White should have played bishop takes f5, with the idea of moving the queen to d3, attacking the f5 pawn, trying to catch up on development, and slow down black's attack. But in the game, white played c3, adding more protection to the d4 pawn and preparing b4 to start a queenside attack. But black's attack crashes through first with g4, attacking the knight on f3 and the pawn on h3, so black will be able to open lines on the next move. By castling queenside, black forced both sides to focus on the plan of attacking on opposite wings. Since black's pieces were better developed and prepared for this plan, black was able to gain an advantage and later won the game. Let's take a look at one more example together. In this position, material is equal, and at first glance the position may look balanced. With white to move, white can force a trade of queens with queen d5 and enter a bishop and pawn ending. Notice black has three pawns that cannot move: a5, c5, and e5. All of these pawns are on dark squares, which restricts the activity of black's dark squared bishop, and these pawns are also fixed targets for white's dark squared bishop. White is blocking these pawns with pawns on a4, c4, and e4. Notice they are all on light squares, so black's bishop can never attack them. White's plan is simple: trade queens and use the king and bishop to attack black's weaknesses on the dark squares. After queen d5 check, queen takes d5. How should white recapture? If c takes d5, this allows black's pawn to advance with c4, opening up the dark squared bishop and allowing black some chances for activity. A much stronger move for white to play is e takes d5. White is now threatening to win a pawn with bishop e1, so black plays bishop d6. Black's bishop protects both the c5 and e5 pawns and is ready to move to c7 to guard the a5 pawn if needed. After trading queens, white's next step is to bring the king into the game and focus on a target. Which pawn can white's king add pressure against? That's right, the e5 pawn. After king f3, king f7, and king e4, white has centralized the king and is beginning to add pressure to the e5 pawn. After king f6, black is trying to hold the position together. In order to win a game of chess, you often need at least two weaknesses. White has pressure on e5 with the king. Can you find a plan that maneuvers the bishop to help attack e5 and attack a second weakness? If you realize that moving the bishop to c3 would attack both e5 and a5 at the same time, great job. After bishop e1, forcing bishop c7, with bishop c3, white now is attacking two weaknesses, the a5 and e5 pawns, at the same time. Notice black's bishop is stuck on c7, as it has to protect pawns on two diagonals. Black's king also can't move, because white would simply win one of the weak pawns. Black can only wait by playing a move such as h6. White has played very well, but how do you win the game? If white can force the king or bishop to move, black will lose the e5 pawn. How can white make this happen? We need to make waiting moves as well, trying to run black out of moves. After h3, if black plays g5, white will run black out of moves with g4. After h5, white freezes black's kingside pawns with h4. Black is now out of waiting moves. If the bishop or king moves, one of black's pawns will fall. If black tries g5, white can win with h takes g5, forcing black's king to move and capture the e5 pawn. Can you find an even stronger move that takes advantage of black's overworked king? If you found the powerful bishop takes e5 check, great job. Black's overworked king cannot protect both the e5 and g5 squares, so after bishop takes e5, h takes g5 check, king takes g5, and king takes e5, white's passed d-pawn will win the game. Are you ready to put your plan into action? Prove it in the challenges. It has been said that chess is 99% tactics. Tactics are an essential part of the game, as finding or missing a tactic often is the difference between winning or losing a chess game below master level. However, tactics do not come out of thin air. You usually need to build a strong position by placing your pieces on good squares and having your pieces work together. Positional advantages include having a well-protected king, more control of the center, enjoying greater space and mobility for your pieces, not having badly placed pieces or pieces that do not have a purpose, and having a healthy pawn structure. Let's take a look at some positions and learn how to improve our positional play. In this fairly closed position, there doesn't appear to be a lot of action or chance for tactics. With black to move, it isn't easy to figure out what black should play. When you are in a position where you don't know what to do, one good positional idea is to find your worst placed piece and improve it. In this position, which black piece appears to be doing very little? Black's knights protect each other and help control the center, and black's bishop on d6 is well centralized, controlling many key dark squares. What about black's bishop on e8? What is it doing? It's preventing black's rooks from being connected, and it isn't really doing anything. How can black improve this piece and give it a purpose? That's right, bishop to h5. This is a strong positional idea. Black's bishop that was doing less than nothing on e8 is now pinning white's f3 knight to the queen, and it also connects black's rooks. Now that the bishop isn't sitting on e8, a black rook could use that square to enjoy the semi-open e-file. After queen to d3, white centralizes the queen, improving its position and unpinning the knight on f3. Notice the queen also attacks black's pawn on f5. Can you see how black can improve a piece and block white's threat of capturing the f5 pawn? If you found knight to e4, great job. Black invades white's territory, placing the knight directly in the center, and also blocks white's queen from threatening the f5 pawn. Notice the f6 square is now available for other pieces to use, and black enjoys a space advantage. One step at a time, black is building a better position. Things are not looking great for black in this position. White has a powerful pawn chain from b2 to e5. White's space advantage is keeping black's pieces passive, and it's hard to find an active plan for black. Notice how white's minor pieces are all pointing at black's kingside. The bishop on d3 is an excellent piece, enjoying an open diagonal on b1 to h7, placing serious pressure on black's kingside. Compare that bishop to black's light-squared bishop. It has very little space and is blocked by its own pawn on d5. Since black's light-squared bishop is clearly worse than white's bishop, black plays bishop to a6, removing one of white's best minor pieces for one of black's less active pieces. When you have less space and your pieces are not as good as your opponent's, trading pieces can often improve your position. After bishop takes a6 and knight takes a6, black's knight on a6 isn't on a great square, but black has removed a lot of pressure from the king side since there is no longer a light-squared bishop attacking the h7 square. Now that black has less to worry about on the king side, black can take time to improve the knight's position on a6. For example, if white attacks the knight with queen e2, where should the knight move? It could move to c7, but it doesn't look very active on that square. Would the knight rather be on c6, where it could put more pressure on white's center? Absolutely. But how can the knight get there? That's right, knight a to b8. Even though retreating the knight to b8 seems wrong, it is a strong plan because once the knight moves to c6, it will be very active. Don't worry about making moves that look bad if the move supports a strong positional plan. Let's take a look at one more position together. In this position, white enjoys a comfortable game. Notice that black has doubled pawns on the c-file, and white's light-squared bishop is pointing at the weak c6 pawn. White only has to gain control of the center and complete development to have a good position. One good plan for white is to play d3, opening up the dark-squared bishop and preparing the plan c3, d4, taking over the center. You might wonder why waste time with d3 if the plan is to play d4. Why not save a move and play c3, preparing d4? After c3, white is threatening d4, attacking black's bishop and taking over the center. Every time you push a pawn, you gain control of new squares, but you also lose control of other squares. Since pawns can never move backwards, make sure there are no problems with the space you leave behind. In this case, notice the pawn on c2 protected d3 and b3. And after the pawn moved to c3, there is a big hole on d3. Can you see how black can take advantage of this weak square and prevent d4? Black can play the powerful queen to d3, taking advantage of the weakness created on d3, preventing d4, and paralyzing white's position. Notice how white's dark-squared bishop is particularly bad. Black plans on completing development with bishop d7 and rook a to e8, when all of black's pieces are working together. White's passive, scattered pieces will be no match. Now that you've learned the importance of positional play, it's time to test your skills. At the beginning of the game, all of the pieces start on the same squares, but it's your job to make your pieces good and avoid having bad pieces. A good piece is active and has a purpose, where it controls important squares and has plenty of space available to move. Good pieces often control enemy squares. The more of those squares, the better. A bad piece is the opposite. It's passive, has very little mobility, and controls little to no opponent's squares. Let's take a look at some examples of good versus bad pieces. In this position, white has a good rook on d1, controlling the only open file on the board. Black's rook, on the other hand, is passive on e8, only controlling space on black's side of the board without any clear targets. White makes the good rook even better by playing rook to d7, taking over the 7th rank and threatening to win the c7 pawn. Black's rook becomes extremely passive after rook to c8. This is a classic case of good piece versus bad piece. White has pressure on c7, which ties down black's rook to passive defense. Notice white's rook also has pressure on g7, so black's king cannot help the rook on the queen side without losing the kingside pawns. Black is helpless, and white has the very simple plan of bringing the king to b7, capturing the a7 pawn, and then promoting the a6 pawn into a queen. Let's take a look at another position together. In this position, black decides to attack the bishop on c4 with knight to a5. Although this threatens to capture white's bishop and double white's pawns on the c-file, White can simply play bishop to a2, retreating the bishop to safety, where it is still a good piece. The bishop controls squares on the a2 to g8 diagonal, and the bishop can also move to the b1 to h7 diagonal, where it will be pointing directly at black's king once the d3 pawn moves out of the way. Notice after black's knight left c6, where it was a good piece controlling key central squares, it is now on the edge of the board and is a bad piece. The knight isn't doing anything useful and controls half the amount of squares it did a move ago. Instead of turning the knight into a bad piece for a one-move attack, what should black have done instead? Notice all of white's minor pieces are developed, controlling important central squares, and are working together. Black's bishop on c8, however, is undeveloped and doing nothing. How can black activate the bishop and turn it into a good piece? A strong move for black is b5. Gaining a tempo by attacking the white bishop, grabbing queenside space, and opening the b7 square for black's light-squared bishop. After bishop to a2 and bishop to b7, black's bishop enters the long diagonal h1 to a8, where it will be a powerful piece, and it also connects black's rooks. Black's position is much better now that the light-squared bishop has been made a good piece. Let's take a look at one more position together. In this position, can you tell which pieces are good and which pieces are bad for both sides? Both sides have good light-squared bishops. Black's bishop on d7 controls two open diagonals, a4 to e8 and h3 to c8. White's light-squared bishop is also actively placed, and it targets the weak b7 pawn. White's dark-squared bishop, on the other hand, protects two pawns, but it is also passive, as it is blocked by those pawns. Notice black's knight is a very bad piece, as it is stuck on the back rank and only has two available squares to move, c6 and e6. With white to move, can you see how white can completely paralyze black's knight on d8 and make the dark-squared bishop a good piece? That's right, with d5. Although white's light-squared bishop is now blocked by the d5 pawn for the moment, white opens up the dark-squared bishop, threatening to win the knight with bishop to f6. The only way to not lose the knight is by moving the pawn on f7 to give the knight an escape square. After f5, white wins the pawn with g takes f6. White now has two passed pawns on f6 and d5, and is ready to activate white's light-squared bishop with d6. White's active and powerful bishops, as well as the extra material, should be enough to win the game. Now that you've learned the importance of making your pieces good and taking advantage of bad pieces, it's time to test your skills. Chess is a game of many opportunities. There is a big difference between a losing position and actually losing the game. A losing position is a position with best play from your opponent. You will lose the game. When you are in a losing position, your job is to create as many problems for your opponent as possible. The best way to do that is to keep a positive attitude and not give up. Let's look at some examples of how to defend losing positions. In this position, black is up a bishop and is doing well. Black's best move is to gain more material and offer a trade of rooks with rook takes a2. When you have a material advantage, it's usually a good idea to offer trades, especially if you can remove your opponent's greatest source of counterplay, the queen. For this reason, black plays queen to f6, skewering the white queen to the unprotected rook on a1. In general, the losing side wants to keep things complicated and to avoid trades, especially the most powerful piece, the queen. White finds a clever idea with queen takes d6. White captures a pawn and offers the rook on a1. In a winning position, You should always look for your opponent's counterplay, especially checks. Black doesn't think that white has any real threats and quickly captures white's rook with queen takes a1. What idea did black overlook? Now that the queen no longer protects d8, white plays queen to d8 check, forcing king to h7. And white salvages a draw from a losing position with queen h4 check. After king g8, white will force a draw after queen d8 check. This is known as a perpetual check. Black cannot escape white's checks, and the game is a draw. Always remember to look for perpetual check opportunities when you are in a difficult or losing position. Let's take a look at another example. In this position, white is up a rook and a pawn and is offering a trade of queens. If the queens are traded, black has no counterplay and will surely lose. Instead of accepting a losing position, black plays the resourceful queen to g7. Black refuses to trade queens, keeping the position complicated. After queen to g7, black has even set up a trap. Do you see it? Remember, the winning side should always look out for chances for counterplay, especially all checks and captures the opponent can make. But when you have a winning advantage, it is easy to get happy and overlook your opponent's ideas. In this position, white should have noticed that black's queen now lines up on the same file as white's king. Always a dangerous situation. With that in mind, white just needs to eliminate any tactics by playing king to h1, removing any possible tricks in the position. Instead, white lunges forward with h4, thinking that black's checks were useless, missing the fact that after knight f3 check, white's bishop is pinned, so black forks the king and the queen. It is easy to get discouraged when you throw away a winning position, but it is important to focus on what you can do now and not worry about the past. After king to f1 and knight takes e1, even though things look difficult for white, after rook takes e1, white should be able to still draw this position. Notice that white's king protects the bishop and pawn on f2, so the only targets black has is the unprotected b4 and h4 pawns. After queen to d4, if white doesn't get discouraged and looks for the best moves, white can hold the position with rook to e4, attacking black's queen and protecting both the b4 and h4 pawns. After queen to d1 check, and rook e1, and queen to b3, black cannot make progress after rook e4. All of white's pieces protect each other. Even though white threw away a winning position, white can still avoid losing by playing careful defense. Let's take a look at one more example together. In this position, white is up two connected passed pawns on the queen side. This should be enough to win the game with careful play. Things don't look good for black, but as the defender, remember to play to your strengths. Even though black is in big trouble on the queen side, do you notice that black has more space on the king side? Black creates a problem for white to solve after queen to h4. Black's queen joins the light-squared bishop in adding pressure to the h3 square. White has a winning position, but once again, it is important to consider your opponent's ideas. White should play bishop to f1, protecting white's king side and eliminating black's chances of a counterattack. Once black's attacking chances are prevented, white's queenside pawns will win the game. Instead of finding the defensive move that should win the game, white is too excited and rushes forward with b7. Pushing the pawn forward, ready to promote the pawn on the next turn, completely overlooking black's powerful bishop sacrifice. Bishop takes h3. White's winning position is now completely losing. Black's threat of bishop takes g2, discovering the queen's check, is too powerful. If white accepts the bishop with g takes h3, the game will finish quickly after queen takes h3 check, and after king g1, queen h2 check, king f1, g2 check, King f2, g1 equals queen, checkmate. If white tries to give the king an escape square on e2 with bishop to d3, black's kingside pressure will be too much to handle after bishop takes g2 check, king takes g2, and queen h2 check. After king to f1, it is now black's turn to be careful. One of the most dangerous moments in a chess game is when you are on the verge of winning. Make sure to double check your opponent's counterplay. If black thinks the position is a simple checkmate after queen to f2 check, black is in for a big surprise after queen takes f2. And once again, white now has a winning position. Black's path to victory begins after g2 check. To avoid checkmate, white must play king to e2. Black now promotes to a second queen with the discovered check, g1 equals queen, check. After king to d1, black's simplest option is to play queen takes a7. Black is now completely winning, but as we should now know, a game of chess is not over until it's over. Can you save a losing position? Let's see.